I'm parked on the shoulder of a quiet county road with red and blue lights flashing in my rearview mirror for the seventh time in less than a month, and the young officer walking toward my truck has the same little smirk she wore the first 6 times. She thinks she's finally broken me, that one more ticket will convince me to leave town and never come back. What she doesn't know is that this beat-up pickup she's laughing at has carried me through some of the hardest years of my life. And I'm not the kind of man who lets someone abuse a badge without eventually answering for it. My name is Ethan Cross, and if you saw me driving through the little town of Maple Creek, Colorado, you'd probably think I was just another middle-aged guy trying to save money by hanging on to an old truck. Honestly, that's exactly what I wanted everyone to think. My truck was a faded green 1997 Chevrolet Silverado with more scratches than shiny paint, a cracked dashboard held together with patience and stubbornness, and a driver's seat that leaned just a little farther back than it should. It wasn't pretty, but every dent had a story. One came from helping my brother move cattle during a spring storm, another from backing into a fallen oak tree after working 16 straight hours. My late father used to say that a truck wasn't supposed to impress people. It was supposed to outlive them. Every time I started that old engine, I heard his voice all over again. I'd rented a small cabin outside Maple Creek for 3 weeks because I needed a break from city life. After 22 years working in law enforcement, I had finally forced myself to take a real vacation. No phone calls, no investigations, no meetings, just coffee on the porch every morning, fishing in the afternoons, and enough quiet to remember what silence sounded like. The locals were friendly enough. Mrs. Harper, who owned the bakery downtown, insisted on giving me an extra cinnamon roll every Tuesday because she said I reminded her of her oldest son. The guy running the hardware store spent 30 minutes explaining which lake had the best trout, even though I never asked. It felt like the kind of town where everyone waved at strangers. At least that's what I believed until I met Officer Danielle Brooks. The first stop happened on my second day. She flipped on her lights just as I left the grocery store parking lot. I figured maybe a brake light had gone out. Instead, she walked up slowly, sunglasses hiding her eyes even though the sun was already dropping behind the mountains. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. I handed them over with a smile and asked if something was wrong. She glanced from my paperwork to my truck, then back at me. Your turn signal didn't stay on long enough before you changed lanes. I blinked. I'm sorry. What? State recommendation is 3 seconds. Yours was closer to 2. She wrote a ticket without another word. $190. I actually laughed after she drove away because I assumed it had to be a misunderstanding. Surely no officer had nothing better to do than count seconds on a turn signal. 3 days later, she stopped me again because my rear license plate had a thin layer of dust from driving gravel roads around the lake. $230. The following week, she claimed my exhaust sounded modified even though the truck still had its original factory system. Another citation. Every conversation followed the same pattern. I'd stay calm. She'd speak like I was wasting her time. Then she'd walk away looking strangely satisfied. The people in town started noticing. One afternoon while I was fueling up, an older rancher shook his head and quietly asked, "She get you too?" I looked over. "Two?" He sighed before climbing into his truck. "Let's just say she decides pretty fast who belongs here and who doesn't." That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. By the 5th stop, I realized this wasn't about traffic laws anymore. She was waiting for me. Twice I spotted her parked across from the diner where I usually grabbed breakfast. Another time, she pulled out from behind an abandoned grain elevator less than 30 seconds after I drove by. It wasn't coincidence. It was routine. Every ticket chipped away at my patience. But what bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the assumption behind every encounter. She had looked at an old truck and decided the man behind the wheel deserved less respect than everyone else. Funny thing about people, they almost always reveal themselves when they think nobody important is watching. I kept asking myself if I should tell her who I really was. It would have taken 5 seconds to flash my credentials and probably ended everything right there. But every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades whispered the same advice. Don't interrupt someone while they're exposing their character. Let them keep talking. Let them keep acting. People build the strongest cases against themselves when they think they've already won. So I stayed quiet. I paid every citation without argument, kept every receipt, wrote down every date, every location, every word she said, not because I was planning revenge, but because old habits die hard. Then came the 23rd day. I walked out of a diner carrying a cup of coffee just in time to see a tow truck backing toward my Silverado. while Officer Brooks stood beside it with her arms crossed. She looked over, smiled like she'd been waiting for that exact moment, and said, "Your truck's officially being impounded. Safety violations. Maybe it's finally time to buy yourself something that belongs on the road." I looked from my truck to the tow operator, then back at her, feeling something inside me become perfectly still instead of angry. Sometimes the loudest decisions happen in complete silence. And as I watched my father's old pickup disappear on the back of that flatbed, I realized my vacation had just ended. I stood there until the tow truck disappeared around the corner, coffee cooling in my hand while the morning traffic rolled past like nothing unusual had happened. Most people think anger feels loud, like yelling or slamming doors. Mine never does. Mine gets quiet. The quieter I become, the more dangerous the situation usually is for whoever pushed me there. I called a rideshare into town, picked up the rental car I'd been trying not to use during my vacation, and drove straight back to the cabin. The first thing I did wasn't unpack or complain. I opened the small fireproof case I'd tucked into the closet on the day I arrived. Inside was the leather credential wallet I hadn't touched since the day before my vacation started. My badge stayed where it was. I wasn't interested in flashing it around like some movie cop trying to win an argument. Instead, I pulled out my identification card, a secure access token, and the notebook I always carried when an investigation mattered. My wife used to joke that she could tell whether I was on vacation by whether that notebook was hidden away. The moment it came out, vacation was officially over. I made one phone call to my captain back in Denver. "I thought you were catching fish," he answered. "I was," I replied. "Now I'm catching something else." He knew me well enough not to ask too many questions. "You need authorization?" "Not yet. I just need you to know I may be documenting misconduct involving another jurisdiction." There was a pause before he answered. "Stay inside policy. Always." The next morning I paid the impound fees without arguing. The clerk behind the counter looked embarrassed before I even reached the desk. "You're not the first person she's brought in this month," he whispered while printing my receipt. "Just don't tell anyone I said that." That sentence was more valuable than any discount could have been. People only whisper when they're afraid. Fear usually has a source. I drove the Silverado back to the cabin, parked it exactly where it had been every day since I arrived, and began doing what I'd spent most of my adult life doing better than almost anyone else. I observed. Instead of looking at Officer Brooks, I started looking at everything around her. Patrol schedules, public incident logs, court filings, municipal meeting minutes, state procurement records, everything that could legally be accessed without crossing a single ethical line. Patterns have a funny way of introducing themselves, if you're patient enough. Within 4 days, I noticed something strange. Brooks seemed unusually aggressive toward visitors driving older vehicles, especially anyone staying outside town limits. Meanwhile, several expensive SUVs registered to influential local residents seemed to receive extraordinary courtesy, warnings instead of citations, broken taillights ignored, expired registrations quietly overlooked. That alone wasn't enough to accuse anyone of corruption, but it was enough to justify asking why. One afternoon, I returned to Mrs. Harper's bakery. She slid a fresh cup of coffee across the counter before I even ordered. "You don't look much like a man on vacation anymore," she said. I smiled. "Do I look that obvious?" "Honey, the last 3 mornings you've been reading public records instead of fishing magazines." I laughed for the first time in days. "Fair point." She leaned closer. "Danielle wasn't always like this. First couple years, she was one of the nicest officers we'd ever had. Something changed after she got close to certain people at City Hall. That caught my attention. I didn't push for names. Experienced investigators never ask leading questions. You let people arrive there themselves." Mrs. Harper simply nodded toward the large brick municipal building across the street. "Power changes people, sometimes faster than money." Over the next 2 weeks, I spent nearly every evening sitting outside a small diner overlooking the town square. Not because I expected dramatic movie scenes, but because ordinary routines reveal extraordinary truths. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Councilman Victor Langford left City Hall at almost exactly 6:15. Most nights he drove home. Occasionally he stopped at a restaurant, but every Wednesday, without fail, he drove 20 minutes outside town to a quiet riverside lodge that mostly catered to tourists during fishing season. 40 minutes later, Officer Brooks would arrive in her patrol vehicle after ending her shift early. They never entered together. They always left separately. Affairs happen every day. They're painful for families, but they're not usually criminal. so I ignored that part and kept looking. Then another pattern appeared. During the same months, Brooks had repeatedly stopped travelers. Councilman Langford had become the loudest supporter of expanding the police department's discretionary enforcement budget. More overtime, more specialized equipment, larger performance incentives tied citation activity. Separately, those facts meant nothing. Together, they deserved another look. The breakthrough came from something almost laughably small. A retired newspaper editor named Walter Benson invited me onto his porch after seeing me photograph an old courthouse plaque. "You're either writing a history book," he joked, "or you're investigating somebody." I smiled without answering. He grinned. That's what I thought. Walter had spent 30 years preserving local newspapers in his basement. Entire walls were lined with carefully labeled boxes. While flipping through archived council reports, one article caught my eye. 3 years earlier, Brooks had publicly praised Councilman Langford for funding new patrol technology during a community safety event. Nothing unusual there, but clipped behind that article was another piece discussing the cancellation of dozens of traffic citations issued to vehicles connected with municipal contractors after requests from council offices. No names, no accusations, just numbers. Numbers can be beautiful when you're investigating because they don't have opinions. They simply exist. I requested additional public records through perfectly legal channels. It took several days, but eventually the documents arrived. Citation dismissals, internal approval chains, vehicle registrations. As I laid them across the cabin table, the puzzle finally started forming a picture. Businesses with political connections receive remarkable flexibility. Visitors and outsiders seemed to make up the difference. Revenue flowed one direction while favors flowed the other. Was every action illegal? No. Was every decision ethical? Not even close. I spent another 10 days verifying everything twice. Every document was cross-checked. Every timeline rebuilt from independent sources. Every assumption challenged before it became a conclusion. That's the difference between suspicion and proof. One afternoon, as I organized another binder, someone knocked on my cabin door. It was Officer Brooks. She glanced at the truck parked outside and smirked. "Still hanging on to this old thing?" she asked. "Runs better than it looks," I answered calmly. She looked around the porch. "You know, some people just don't fit towns like ours." I met her eyes for the first time since the impound. Maybe, or maybe some towns forget who they're supposed to serve. She laughed like I'd just told the world's weakest joke, tipped her sunglasses back into place, and walked away completely convinced she was still in control. The moment her patrol car disappeared down the road, I carried the final folder into the cabin, placed it on top of the others, and stared at a stack of evidence nearly 3 inches thick. Every receipt, every citation, every schedule, every witness statement, every public record. It wasn't revenge sitting on that table. Revenge is emotional. This was something much colder. Accountability. By the end of that evening, I had finished a comprehensive report supported by documents instead of opinions, timelines instead of rumors, facts instead of anger. I sealed the envelope, addressed identical copies to the county sheriff's professional standards office, the state ethics commission, and the district attorney's public integrity division, then set them beside the front door ready to mail first thing the next morning. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, I looked at my old Silverado sitting quietly beneath the pine trees and realized that none of this had ever really been about an old truck. It had always been about what happens when someone mistakes unchecked authority for untouchable power. And the first domino was finally about to fall. The envelopes went out the next morning by certified mail, and for the first time in weeks there was absolutely nothing left for me to do except wait. That's the part people never show you in movies. Investigations aren't exciting every minute. Most of the time they're paperwork, patience, and wondering whether anyone with authority will actually do the right thing. I stayed in Maple Creek another week because my cabin rental hadn't expired yet, and life settled into an almost uncomfortable calm. I went fishing again. I helped Walter Benson repair a section of fence behind his house. Mrs. Harper kept pretending she wasn't slipping an extra cinnamon roll into my bag every other morning. It almost felt normal, until the calls started. First came an investigator from the county sheriff's professional standards office, asking if I would be available to clarify several timelines in my report. Then the district attorney's office requested copies of supporting documents I had already indexed. Finally, someone from the State Ethics Commission simply said, "Mr. Cross, thank you for organizing this as thoroughly as you did. It saved us weeks. That was the first moment I knew the evidence wasn't going to disappear into someone's desk drawer. 3 days later, I happened to be eating breakfast near the courthouse when two unmarked county vehicles pulled into the parking lot beside City Hall. Nobody came running outside. There were no television cameras, just investigators carrying briefcases, walking calmly through the front entrance, while employees quietly watched from the windows. Accountability rarely arrives with sirens. Most of the time it shows up wearing a plain jacket and carrying a clipboard. Rumors spread through town faster than the official announcements did. By that afternoon, people were whispering in grocery store aisles and gas stations. The following Monday, the sheriff's office confirmed Officer Danielle Brooks had been placed on administrative leave, pending multiple internal investigations involving selective enforcement, professional misconduct, and violations of departmental policy. Councilman Victor Langford publicly denied any wrongdoing, but 2 days later the town council announced an emergency ethics review concerning several municipal decisions connected to law enforcement funding. The pressure built exactly the way pressure always does, quietly, then all at once. About a week later, I received another call asking me to return for a formal interview. As I walked into the administration building, Officer Brooks was leaving with her attorney. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had laughed beside my truck only weeks earlier. Our eyes met for a second. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. There wasn't any satisfaction in seeing another career collapse, even one built on abusing power. There was only relief that someone had finally drawn a line. Months passed before the investigations officially concluded. The final findings were exactly what they should have been. Brooks lost her certification after multiple policy violations were sustained. Several improperly issued citations were dismissed, including every one written to me. The town reimbursed my towing expenses, legal costs, lost wages, and the fines I had paid, along with additional compensation for the administrative errors that had followed. Councilman Langford resigned before the Ethics Commission released its full report, insisting the decision was personal. But very few people believed that explanation. Maple Creek hired an outside consultant to review traffic enforcement procedures, body camera compliance, and supervisory oversight. Mrs. Harper called me a month later just to say the atmosphere in town finally felt lighter. People wake again, she told me. Sounds silly, doesn't it? No, I answered. That's usually the first thing communities lose when trust disappears. Before heading home to Denver, I drove one last time to the center of town in that same faded green Silverado. It still rattled over railroad tracks. The paint was still peeling. The dashboard was still cracked exactly where my father had accidentally dropped a wrench 15 years earlier. Nothing about the truck had changed, and somehow that made me smile. People spend so much time judging what they can see that they forget character is almost always hiding beneath the surface. Officer Brooks saw an old pickup and assumed the man behind the wheel wouldn't fight back. She never imagined that patience could be stronger than anger, or that respect for the law sometimes means exposing the people who wear its uniform without honoring its purpose. My father used to tell me that integrity is what you choose when nobody's keeping score. I think about that every time I turn the key in that old truck. It still starts on the first try. It still reminds me that appearances are cheap, but principles are expensive. And if there's one lesson I carried away from Maple Creek, it's this. Power doesn't corrupt overnight. It grows one small unchecked decision at a time, until someone finally has the courage to say, enough. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Officer Brooks deserved to lose her career, or should she have been given a second chance? Have you ever been judged because of the car you drove, the clothes you wore, or the first impression someone made about you? Share your thoughts in the comments because conversations like this matter. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.